Okay, well, welcome everyone after lunch to this session on coercion, deterrence, and cyber weapons. And when we survey the field and listen to the conversations around cyber, in inverted commas, we hear a lot of talk about success and failure of particular operations, of particular initiatives. And I've heard that a lot the last couple of days, both here at CyCon and at the Munich Cybersecurity Conference. Instead of success and failure, perhaps we should be reframing some of these questions as questions of strategy. And strategy, of course, is about harnessing ways and means to achieve particular ends. It's what Lawrence Friedman, much beloved of our Department of War Studies, talks about. He says, strategy is the art of creating power. And from my perspective and others, sometimes when we talk about cyber, the conversation around it is both strategic in the sense that we lose sight of those strategic goals, but it's also ahistorical. And to do strategy properly, you need an appreciation of history. What's come before, in some sense, guides what we can do in the future. But the thing to say about strategy is that it's also a relationship. It's a relationship between you and your rival or adversary. So it's not just about what you do or what you want to do, but it's also about what you want your opponent to do. What behavior change do you want to bring about, and how are you going to bring that about? And within a strategic framework, coercion is one of those key concepts that we need to consider. And coercion, of course, comes in a few flavors, of which compellence and deterrence are the whats of coercion. And that raises questions then about how you might want to coerce an opponent, which, of course, brings in issues around offensive cyber capabilities and much, much more. So hopefully our panelists are going to discuss these issues and we'll turn it over once they've presented to a Q&A. So please get your questions ready. We're going to start in the order presented in the handbook with Quentin Hodgson, who is a senior researcher of the RAND Corporation. His research focuses on cyber operations, cybersecurity, risk management, and strategic planning. And before RAND, he worked at the MITRE Corporation as a cyber principal, and before that, at the US Department of Defense, working on defense strategy, force planning, and cyber policy. And that stint included a chief of staff and director for plans, operations, and programs in the Office of Cyber Policy for the Secretary of Defense. So, Quentin, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here, and appreciate also the organizers of this event for inviting me to come and talk about this topic today. It's part of a larger project that I'm undertaking at the RAND Corporation, so I'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to certainly give time for question and answer at the end, so I won't. I have a few slides. I apologize. That's probably my DoD background. I can't speak without the PowerPoint. But basically, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the overall project that we're undertaking at RAND, look a little bit at definitions and theory to make sure that we're all talking about the same kinds of things, or at least you can have a different take, but we can have a debate about that. I'll talk very briefly about the case studies, but I hope that people will read the paper and will have comments, thoughts, ideas, and I certainly welcome those either today or you can reach out to me afterwards. And then some parting thoughts. Since I'm in the midst of this research, I'm not sure if I have concrete conclusions, and you'll probably see that if you read the paper as well that's in the book. So the overall project that we're undertaking is trying to understand the basic guiding questions. What is cyber coercion? How will we recognize it when it's happening? And more importantly, what can we do about it? So the goals are to understand really how can a state use cyber capabilities as a coercive tool of statecraft. And an important point of distinction, that's not to say that non-state actors, other groups can't use cyber capabilities potentially as a coercive tool, but the focus of this research is really about how do states think about it and how are they using it. And what I'd like to ultimately end up with is a framework or some way of helping the United States, its allies, and partners to counter this challenge, to really understand, do we have a way of really articulating what is cyber coercion, anticipate when it's going to happen, something that was just talked about in the last panel discussion about social media. Are we solving just the problems that we've identified, or are we actually looking forward? Method, I come from RAND Corporation, we're very big on rigorous methods, so I have to point out that this is based on literature review, some case study analysis on a few countries. I'm only going to talk about Russia and North Korea today. We're doing work looking at China and Iran. That's not to say that they are the only states that can undertake cyber operations for coercive means. It is entirely possible that other states, including states represented in this room, could do that. But the focus is really from a Western NATO perspective of what can we do about it. And one of the things I want to also do is postulate future scenarios and look at how would you then recognize those scenarios, how might they emerge, and how might this framework help us address those. Another important point to make is, as Tim introduced this panel, is it's really a strategy-oriented research. It's not a technical analysis of cyber operations, although there's a certain amount of that needs to be done. But I think a lot of the things that you see, reports that are put out, the very good reports by cybersecurity research firms, even things that are put out by government agencies, when they're assessing the impact of certain activities, they go into very detailed length about the origins, the technical aspects, what vulnerabilities were exploited, and those are all extremely important elements. But what I'm trying to do is raise up that conversation to a strategy level and say, what is really the intent of these operations? How do they fit in a broader context? What do we think about them? And what is potentially the motivations for an adversary or another state that is trying to undertake these kinds of campaigns? So a word about definitions. Everything starts with Thomas Schelling, of course. In fact, all three of us quote Thomas Schelling in our paper. So you'll see that there's at least that common theme. And as Tim noted, that there are really two forms of coercion that he identified: active coercion or compellence, and then passive coercion or deterrence. I am quoting some RAND colleagues of mine and saying that coercion is the use of threatened force, including the limited use of actual force to back up the threat, to induce an adversary to behave differently than it otherwise would. So this is an important point to take a moment to reflect on. In the last discussion that we had before the break, before General Neller's great presentation, there's a lot of focus on social media, how it can be harnessed to create divisions in society, to amplify those kinds of divisions. That is not the focus of the research that I am conducting, and I want to be clear that that doesn't mean that I do not see it as extremely important that we get after these issues, such as how is social media and other platforms used to drive divisions in society. What I am focused on is how can a state use cyber capabilities to inflict or to threaten to inflict actual harm in terms of physical damage or economic damage on another state. And I put that in a context, having done strategic studies as a graduate student and studied at the Alter Clausewitz, that one thing is that war is the continuation of politics by other means, but it is also an act of violence. And it's important to keep that in mind, that we use the moniker war for a lot of things that really are not war. There are a lot of things that happen in cyberspace that are not war as well. Exploitation, denial of service could lead to some real physical impacts. So I'm not saying that there are clean-cut divisions, but I think it's important to really be honest about what we're talking about and to be focused on those things that make a real difference. So when I was doing this research, I found actually there was quite a rich literature already that has emerged over the last 10 years talking about cyber coercion, talking about the ways that deterrence may or may not apply in this field. And what I saw was particularly a lot of the theory focused on coercion being a function of some clear threat that an actor who is claiming responsibility will make to evoke an explicit desired behavior on the part of some adversary. What I equate that to is it's sort of the equivalent of a kidnapping demand or something along those lines, to say, I will do this very specific thing to you if you do not do the following things, and here's what I want you to do about it. But what I found is an observed practice that coercion is often a mixture of vague threats, sometimes an implied actor, or implicit desired behavior. And I think this is important when you think about the context in which these particular case studies that I've identified. It's very hard to see a clear lineage between whether there was a clear threat in the first place, to what extent was that threat tied to an explicit behavior that was desired, and then also whether even that actor who was making the threat is clearly making the threat and saying, hello, I am X actor, I am making this demand of you. Now, in the context here, you'll see that coercion is really not an either or. It can be a combination of those. It could be an actually explicit actor, but not very explicit threats that are being made. And some of that, I will argue, really comes out of the context of the nature of the relations that have existed between states and will evolve between states. So the case studies that I look at in the paper are looking particularly at North Korea, and I cite the specific examples of Sony Pictures, but also ongoing cyber attacks on South Korean banking, media, and government entities. The Sony Pictures case is interesting, and I should say that when I think of case studies, I am thinking more broadly in terms of these particular states and how they have used cyber capabilities to try to achieve their ends. Now I'm going to contradict myself somewhat when I talk about the Sony case, because that one at least started with a very clear, explicit demand on the part of the North Korean government. They actually went to the UN and they said, we know that this movie is being made as an act of violence against our state and you must stop it. I have no idea why they thought the UN could do anything about that, but that's what they did. But then as the incident progressed, you had false flag operations, and I'm not going to belabor all the details about what happened to Sony Pictures, but the blaming of other actors and the North Koreans explicitly saying this was not us. By the way, the North Koreans always say it wasn't them. You know, they have sunk naval vessels and said, nope, it wasn't us. Must have been somebody else who has reason to sink a South Korean naval vessel. They've shelled offshore islands of the South Korean state. Said, nope, that wasn't us. Must be somebody else. And there may be a variety of reasons. And anybody who can intuit what the North Koreans are thinking, I applaud you, because it certainly is an opaque state to try to understand what their motivations are. I think there's some measure of domestic audience, and then there's some measure of they probably know that we don't believe them, but that's the way they act. But then you look at the broader case of activities they've undertaken. This is a state that most people 5 years ago would have thought was completely technologically backward. It is investing all of its money into the development of nuclear weapons, and it is starving its people literally. But that's actually, they've shown a surprising capability to build up the assets and infrastructure to conduct cyber operations. So one of the things I think we also have to think about is, are we making assumptions, implied or otherwise, about a state and its abilities that maybe we should take a second look at? And I think about, for instance, in the early 2010-2011 period, most people would not have anticipated that Iran would become a significant cyber actor, but it very quickly did emerge that way. On the Russian side, one of the focus in the paper is looking at how Russia has acted in Ukraine, and everybody jumps to looking at the black energy attacks on the power sector, particularly the December 2015, which is a reasonably significant incident because of the extent of the attack and what it affected. Of course, some people say, well, it only affected power for a few hours, what's the big deal? But I think if you parlay that into looking at the broader array of activities that have been undertaken in Ukraine over the course of that conflict and tie it to the broader context of what the Russians are trying to achieve, which I think is essentially, it's a signaling operation as well as physical operations to say that you are part of our near abroad, you are not part of Europe, and you must remain part of our sphere of influence and control. So we can go into a lot more detail on these case studies if people have specific questions, but I do want to be respectful of my co-panelists' time and just end with a few parting thoughts. One is that I think it's extremely important to understand the context in which these activities are taking place. So an attack on the Ukrainian infrastructure is not an isolated incident. It is something that takes place in the broader context of a conflict, and that's clearly the case there. It's also interesting to look at these factors that I point out, where sometimes the actor is not explicit in what they want, and sometimes they even try to deny it's them, but they're still carrying out these cases, that it's not clear that then coercion is really going to succeed in those discrete cases. But it may be that they see it has utility in terms of the broader campaigns. And it has certainly not stopped any of these states from carrying out these kinds of acts. The fact that it may or may not have achieved their immediate ends, it may have been part of a broader intimidation and coercion. So how do we think about preventing and mitigating cyber coercion? So I'm going to probably do the good academic thing and say there's more research to be done. There are more questions to be asked, but I think 4 of them that strike me as really important is, one, when you think about things that people postulate, and Joe and I had a great article a couple of years ago in International Security, he looked at 4 elements, looking at cost imposition, denying adversary the objectives, and so forth. He talks about entanglement, and the question is, when it comes to cyberspace, can we credibly threaten cost imposition on states? Some of that is the believability of it, and there are some thresholds we have to think about. We tend to think in general terms about cyber activity and cyber attacks, but we all know that they come in very different flavors and sorts. The United States Senate, the Senate Armed Services Committee has been routinely asking the Department of Defense and the President of the United States, define what a deterrent strategy is for cyberspace. And I kind of chuckle at that because you have to think about, well, what are you trying to deter? I think that's one of the key questions you have to ask first. Is it like the police? Are you trying to deter petty crime? Sure, you're trying to deter petty crime. Are you going to stop it? No, you are not going to stop it. And the question also, are you going to be able to deter their ability to achieve their objectives through better defense? Well, that depends. I mean, what are you trying to defend? How much of it do you need to defend? What do the risks entail? Entanglement, which talks about sort of those interlinkages. We see that some states, Russia, for instance, has announced that basically they want to figure out a way that they can hive off their portion of the internet. So they want to be less entangled with the West. So is that really a way forward? And then finally, are norms going to shape behavior of actors who see benefit from cyber coercion? This morning, the statement was made that NATO is not a norms-making body. I disagree. I think that it may not articulate norms in and of itself, but through its actions, it can establish norms. And that's the important piece, is that norms are not something that you simply put on a piece of paper and say, these are our norms. The norms are something that come out of the actions that states take to adhere to those norms, to say that these are the things we believe in and how we carry them forward. So I hope that this has been thought-provoking. I look forward to your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, Quentin. There's a lot to go on there, and I particularly, approve of the looking at these issues contextually, and also looking at cyber operations as one tool amongst many in the strategic toolbox, as it were. You mentioned this idea of vagueness, and in the paper you do look a little bit at this issue of ambiguity. Could you perhaps tease out a little bit what the strategic utility of ambiguity is in this domain? Is there anything specific or peculiar about the way strategic ambiguity works in cyberspace?
Well, it's a very good question. I think the first thing that strikes me is that the strategic ambiguity helps in terms of trying to mitigate the response, which is that this idea of how do you credibly threaten a response if the state can say, well, how do you really know it's us, and that may be because the difference, one of the things we have to also think about is the difference in the audiences that you're trying to play to. So when you think about the issue of attribution, for instance, there's technical attribution, which says we have determined as these particular actors based on artifacts in the code that they're using in practices that they take, particular IP ranges. But then there's a much higher level of attribution, is that we believe that this activity was directed or was instigated at the behest of some state actor. And that's one where there's a lot more ambiguity, and it's probably beyond the realm of purely cyber attribution. It's more of a political and intelligence role. So I think that those issues, it's part of what potentially mitigates against the effectiveness of cyber coercion, but it also makes it so that the ambiguity of what can I retaliate against and how credibly am I going to be able to signal that, not just in terms of that dynamic, the dyad of the two actors, but the broader audience. We saw that with North Korea when the first attributions were made to the North Koreans for the Sony case, and many people came out and said, no, it couldn't be because of the following reasons. And that creates time limitations, that extends things out. And that also creates a dilemma for the state that is going to respond, because the United States or its allies, it wants to be perceived as having a legitimate reason to respond.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm sure there's lots we can revisit in Q&A. Okay, so from compellence to its coercive twin, deterrence. And we have Aaron Brantley, and Dr. Brantley is Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science and the Human Center for National Security and Technology at Virginia Tech. He's also the Cyber Policy Fellow at the US Army Cyber Institute. His research looks at national security policy issues in cyberspace, including terrorism, intelligence, decision-making, and human rights. And he's written a couple of very good books. The first is The Decision to Attack, Military and Intelligence Cyber Decision-Making from 2016, and a recently co-edited volume on US national cybersecurity, international politics, concepts, and organization. I recommend both. But Aaron, the cyber deterrence problem, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, let me say thank you very much to NATO, CCDCOE, and particularly Laurie and others who've put so much effort into bringing us here. This is actually part of a larger project that I'm working on with several people in the audience as well, funded through an OSD Minerva grant, RDEF, Research for Defense grant. And so it's part of a broader project on examining the challenges associated with deterrence moving forward, and particularly the challenges associated with deterrence in cyberspace. And I'll pick up where the last speaker left off and start with a quote from Joe Nye's article in 2017. The dissuasion of someone from doing something by making them believe that the cost to them will exceed their expected benefit. It's the basics of deterrence. We're trying to change the way in which an adversary perceives cost. In order to do that, deterrence requires a few fundamental concepts that we must establish. And these concepts are extremely difficult to establish in cyberspace for a variety of reasons. And like any good father, I'm going to use my children as examples for how deterrence is established in a meaningful way. The first is you have to be able to convey credibility. And I'll get into this a little bit in a few later slides. But the general premise of credibility is the establishment of mechanisms or tools or capabilities that are able to be shown or demonstrated to an adversary to be able to threaten or to deny or some other type of activity. For my kids, it's just being bigger than they are and having control over their resources and other types of things. No, you can't play with that. No, you can't watch TV. I also have to signal when they've crossed a line. I have to signal when they've done something wrong. I have to make that dad face or something along those lines. I have to express that something has gone wrong. I have to signal that certain behaviors are not acceptable. In order to do that, I have to be specific. And this is a little bit going back to what we heard this morning about ambiguity. If I tell my kids, I have 3 boys, if I say, hey, if you violate some unstated rule sometime in the future, you're going to be punished. How many of you are parents? That's not going to work, okay? They're going to do everything up to that one random point in time in which they get punished. In which case, they've basically worn me and my wife out, and we're exhausted by that particular process. And so we have to think through this idea of specificity. We can't just be ambiguous. Deterrence that lacks specificity allows for an enormous amount of actions to occur before it reaches some unspecified threshold. The other fundamental problem is attribution. Since I have 3 boys, if one of them draws on the wall and I go and I try and get them all to admit to it, it's very difficult for me to attribute which one did it. They each say he did it. And this is the case with North Korea or Russia or others. We can attribute through technical means, through political means and others, but attribution still remains a problem. And in LOAC and other types of law, attribution is important. The other problem is that in a conventional sense, we can assess costs and benefits fairly measurably. We take out this many tanks, we take out this many carriers, this many troops, this many planes. So we can create very rational metrics. In cyberspace, it's a little different. We also have to think about not just rationality, but cognition and other types of things. We think about the development of decision-making in terms of deterrence along this spectrum associated with before attack, ante impetuum, in attack, in impetuum, and post-attack, post-impetuum. Now, deterrence by denial works up to the point at which the attack starts to engage. Once they start successfully penetrating the walls, the denial procedures lose some degree of effectiveness. The threats of punishment measures also begin to lose effectiveness. Now, they can still, in some ways, manipulate how severe an attack might be, but not necessarily. But then we also have to think about the timeline afterwards. If I threaten to punish my children for something that they did that I didn't specify, and then I punish them, but I punish them 6 months down the road for drawing on the wall, how can they make the connection between drawing on the wall and the punishment that they receive? So if I don't attribute quickly, if I don't respond with a specific response, a credible, specific response in a timely manner, the temporal disconnect between the action-reaction pair is such that it makes deterrence ineffective. If we think about deterrence, and I'm really just focused, there's other deterrence mechanisms, but I'm just focused on 2 right now, and in other papers I have more. Deterrence by threats of punishment. In order to establish credibility, we have to build capabilities in the ante-impetuum phase. And then we see that the adversary starts gaining benefit over time, which incurs to us additional costs. We then have to incur additional costs to engage or actuate a punishment activity. Whereas by contrast, our adversary in the top right incurs a little bit of cost to engage in a cyber attack, reaps an enormous amount of benefit, and then receives an asymmetric cost in response. It's very difficult in cyberspace, within domain in particular, to calibrate our response to their benefit. I think we see this over and over again for the most part. Deterrence by denial. We start building capabilities to deter over time. We can't just stop deterring through denial. We can't take down the firewalls, open up our systems and everything when the Russians get in. Okay? Because then that allows everybody else to get in. We have to keep the walls, all the security mechanisms up. And I'm using gross analogies. So, but the perception is that once they're in, they're in and they can run about. There are other fundamental problems associated with deterrence as well in cyberspace. In a kinetic sense, if I want to deter somebody, I threaten action against a specific target. It's very unlikely that somebody's going to move a city, a military base, or some other tangible target. They can't move Moscow. But they can take down a digital asset. So we get a 404. They can patch it and update it. So all the work that the national mission team did to gain access to a system is for naught, because all of a sudden that system is no longer the system that we had persistent access to. They can claim that it wasn't them who did it, say that it was a third party or something along those lines. And then, as I mentioned, there's a significant problem of time. The idea of time is fundamental. For denial, there's a bunch of other significant problems as well. The notion that we have a very complex set of networks. One of the things the DoD in the United States and others has done is to reorganize and cut down the surface space of its networks. But still, we have a lot of fundamental challenges, complex problems associated with deterrence in there. And I've written about most of them in these 2 contexts in the article. Deterrence must be understood as a highly contingent tool. It is not a blank check available upon demand. It is an instrument of statecraft that has to be seen in the context in which conflicts have arisen. Very often, in fact, I was in a meeting at US Cyber Command earlier this year, and it very frequently sounds like we use deterrence as the hammer and everything else is the nail. We have to be more dynamic in how we think about this. We have to use more tools of state, of society, and beyond. And with that, I leave you with a broadened toolbox from the first slide. So, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Great, thanks, Aaron. There's a school of thought, and I don't know if Richard Harknett's here, but he would argue that denial is not a form of deterrence at all, in the sense that, yes, you might foil an attack, but you haven't deterred the attack in the first place, or the attempt to compromise your system. You might dissuade subsequent attacks a little bit further down the track, But until you do that, an attacker is potentially trying to probe, compromise, and damage your systems. Put that to one side for a moment. There's also another form of deterrence by denial. You're describing the pre-event form. There's also a post-event form that crops up in the literature, which we know by another name, which is resilience. Does that fall under the deterrent framework at all? Or?
I think yes, resilience can fall under it, but it falls under very limited circumstances. So it depends obviously on the attacker's objective. So very often, particularly in the Tallinn manuals and others, they don't necessarily consider the attacker objective. But for resilience to be a deterrent fact, obviously the objective of the adversary is important. If the objective of an adversary is to simply gain money or gain resources, in the case of a North Korea, then being resilient in your systems is not as important as being able to deter them in the first place, to deny them in the first place. If the idea is to take down power grids and other types of things, being resilient can be a form of deterrence because you have fail-safe mechanisms that can then maintain that particular level of service and other types of things. So I think it's a conditional state. It really depends on the environment and the adversary with whom you engage.
And of course, a lot of sunk costs,
yes,
demonstrating resolve and so on.
Yes.
Yeah. I think I recently described parenting as a mixture of threats, bribes, and coercion.
Yeah.
So I entirely agree with you. The other thing you learn from being a parent is that you pick your battles.
Yes.
I'm not sure we have that option necessarily in cyber, but sometimes we can at least determine the ground we're going to fight those battles on. Thank you. We're going to move on to Max Smeets, who co-authored a paper with Herb Lin, who I'm sure we all know. Dr. Smeets is a cybersecurity fellow at Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation. He's also a non-resident policy fellow at New America, and he's working on a book at the moment on the causes underlying cyber proliferation and restraint. He was too modest to mention in his bio that he recently was awarded the Amos Perlmutter Prize for his article A Matter of Time in the Journal of Strategic Studies, which I think is an excellent article, not least of which because I researched time and temporality in international relations, so it's great to see people working in that space. But Max, over to you.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be back here in Tallinn. So my paper, which I'm going to present here today, is co-authored with Dr. Herb Lin, who's also based at Stanford. I believe I don't have to tell this audience that there is still much strategic thinking to do when it comes to the use of offensive cyber operations. Indeed, the statement made by General Keith Alexander during his nomination hearing to become the first commander of US Cyber Command still very much applies to the world we face today. And so in line with the previous discussions, I would like to address a seemingly simple question, and that is, do offensive cyber capabilities have the potential to change the role of military power? In this presentation, with offensive cyber capabilities, I primarily refer to CNA activity, computer network attacks, those activities which seek to disrupt, deny, degrade, or destroy. And with respect to the roles of military power, I borrow from a framework of a scholar called Robert J. Ard, who talks about the fact that military capabilities can have one of the following four functions. Defense, deterrence, and compellence are, of course, three well-known concepts. And then with swaggering, he means something which is the fact that sometimes military capabilities are used not for direct strategic kind of effects, but instead for reputational or prestige purposes. So if, for example, North Korea might want to develop nuclear weapons, not necessarily to just deter the United States or other actors, but also because it wants to be perceived as a modern state and be part of a nuclear club, so to say. And so the main argument which we make in the paper is put on this slide with a lot of information. The overall point is, yes, offensive cyber capabilities are able to affect the roles of military power. More specifically, there are new opportunities for defense and compellence, but they downgrade the role of deterrence and swaggering. Although there is more nuance underlying each of those points, for this presentation, I'm only going to focus on compellence, as I believe there are a number of interesting dimensions there. So, as already came up, the compellent use of military force does either one of the following two things, right? It's either to stop an activity already undertaken, or is to make sure that an adversary will do something he or she has not yet undertaken. Now, the conventional shelling argument, and which the literature has followed on ever since, is that deterrence is said to be a lot easier. Because in the case of deterrence, the deterred party doesn't need to do anything visible to be deterred. Whereas in the case of compellence, with its changing its behavior, there might be audience or public costs involved in it. So take a very potentially extreme provoking example where Russia might intervene in a country military intervention, and it's an ally of the United States. The US responds, and in an extreme situation will start bombing assets or doing some counter-value in Russia. The notion is that even though in this case the military intervention might be of such a significant cost that Russia may want to retreat, due to the fact that retreat may come at a public cost and lose face, both domestically and internationally, they may not do so. That's at least the conventional argument. In a variety of compellent scenarios, is my argument, there are a number of distinct advantages which offensive cyber capabilities have, and I'm going to discuss 3 of them here today. First, there is this notion, which I believe, of a larger potential to deny causal effects. It's not that the effects of offensive cyber operations are not public, but it's the fact that you're more likely to be able to deny them, and that has implications. So let's take, again, a very basic case of a missile, and that is a missile and not a pineapple, which drops on a building or whatever, a bridge. In this case, it's very difficult for the actor which suffers from these costs to, of course, deny that this was caused by anything else other than a missile. It's difficult to say that this was caused by, I don't know, a system error or random failure. That's different when we think about the use of offensive cyber capabilities, right? In which there are a wide range of scenarios in which we could see that maybe, and I've put up here a picture of an airport where maybe through malicious use, certain airplanes might not take off, and yet there's a greater potential to say, well, this was actually caused by a random system update or something like that. And the notion is there that, at least in theory, that will have a number of opportunities to save face. There are 2 other distinct advantages on paper, and that's the notion of reverse effects. Now, reverse effects does not seem to be something new, right? Of course, again, going to the simple example of dropping a missile on a building, the actor who suffers those losses can decide whether they're going to rebuild that building or bridge or whatever that is. The interesting thing with cyber here would be my argument is that actually here the initiative might have been changed. If in intelligent design, the initiative to potentially reverse effects now lies in the hands of the attacker. If done well, he's able to control whether or not the effects can be reversed. And as we discussed in the paper, we discussed 4 different ways to do so in the paper. But I think there are a number of other potential designs out there as well. I could think about certain specific DDoS attacks which might apply here. To go back then to the example on how that relates to compellence, if you take this extreme case of like the US responding to Russia, and the conventional case, and a conventional extreme case where it would be continuing to bomb Russian assets in the country until it stops the intervention, the moment Russia would retreat, it doesn't retrieve its earlier assets, right? Those costs it has suffered. It only won't suffer any follow-on losses. The notion of reversibility here would be that you not only are able to ensure that no further costs will incur, but potentially you will be also able to retrieve some of the benefits which you've lost in the past of some of the assets. At least that's, again, the point in theory. Third point, very quickly, is that my argument would be that there is no longer a direct or some correlation between a geographical dispersion of an effect and the likelihood of collateral damage. And that's, of course, different when we think about conventional cases. So in the case of cyber, you might consider, I'm only going to attack system X of, I don't know, airports or something like that, which could be across a whole country. Whereas, of course, you can't, in very basic terms, again, a missile, you can't differentiate it. Like, I'm going to drop this missile, and within that radius, this building will be destroyed, the building next to it won't be, and then 10 buildings further, I'm going to destroy another one. Now, that's beautiful in theory. Great. But there are a number of issues in practice. And those are, of course, as relevant as, if not more important. And I've put up a number of dimensions here, and I've given them kind of weird names because I couldn't come up with better terms, but please feel free to change them if you have a better idea. So the first one is that of what I call the constant contact problem, right? If you want to compel an actor, in this case, you would need to make sure that the levels of damage or harm need to be perceived significant enough that the actor actually perceives it as a cost and want to change its behavior. And it sounds easy, but it might be more difficult, not only from the technical perspective of the use of a capability, but also because it needs to be distinguished from the constant kind of noise or activity which is already going on in this domain, the number of high-level attacks which already take place. There's also this plausible deniability problem, where sometimes we have said that it's an advantage to the attacker, but in this case it might be a disadvantage, and hence there needs to be some form of communication, either through the use of the capability or other channel to make sure that the actor knows who's behind it. The third-party problem, which I call it here, is that, yes, saving face may sound beautiful and really, really nice. But we can think about a wide range of cases which already have occurred, where both actors might want to deny that the effect was caused, but still it has become open in the public. Take a case like Stuxnet. At least the US and Israel have never confirmed that they were behind the attack, and so as Iran for a long time denied that anything happened to their systems. And yet through reporting initially of Fares Blockada, and then Ralph Langner Group, and then Symantec, and so on, with potentially different incentives, we still have a sufficient or a good amount of information about it. Two other problems, yes, we can talk especially about self-propagating malware, about the likelihood of a mismatch between intended and actual effect. And finally, when we think about especially reversibility, there might be a loss of trust problem. Yes, reversibility might sound like a beautiful concept, and it's especially now thrown in a lot also in legal discussions around the use of offensive cyber operations. But inevitably, well, even if you would be able to reverse the system of your adversary, or for instance, give its data back, etc., there will be a loss of trust in that system by that actor. Now, the point here is not that each of these issues cannot be solved. I do believe through a variety of ways, and we could discuss them, that each of these dimensions, each of these problems can be overcome. What's interesting, if we combine these with the, so to say, advantages, or the distinct advantages, it's very difficult to achieve what might be called combination effects, or effects combos, whatever you want to call them. And let me end with one final example of that. So think again about reversible effect and controlling that, right? To control the effects and to make sure that you potentially are able to reverse that, you want to remain within cyberspace, right? The moment you go beyond that and cause some, let's say, real physical damage, the chances are close to impossible to ever reverse those effects. And yet when we think about the constant contact problem, to make sure that we cause significant amount of harm or damage, to make sure that the costs are high enough to make sure that the other actor compels, then you're much more likely to go beyond cyberspace in your effects. And so to make sure that these two, to make sure that you cancel out potential practical implications is going to be very difficult. So I'm put up this question here, which in a way is a question. It's the fact that, yes, I do really believe that there are new ways in which we can conceive of compellence, which we have never really been able to do before, through a combination of issues, of which of three of them I've laid out here. But they do come with a set of conditions, and do, of course, are, as previous panelists have mentioned, are inherently context dependent. I thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to any questions. I've put up some forthcoming and other research here as well, in case you're interested and would like to discuss it. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Great. I'm reminded there's an argument that occasionally crops up in the literature on the ethics of the use of offensive cyber capabilities in war, which is that there was actually an ethical imperative to use offensive cyber capabilities to reduce the expenditure of blood and treasure, to limit civilian casualties, etc., etc. Do you think that's a plausible argument, given the problems that you raised? I mean, I know it's a slightly different context, but just think.
So that already assumes, right, that you might be able to use offensive cyber capabilities as a substitute to conventional capabilities in the case of warfare. So I'll take that then as a starting point, right? And this bloodless war thesis, so to say, is relying on both sides, right? So one is the kind of notion that indeed the use of a capability in its effects might be less damaging, and we can then, and I'm not sure if I buy that, because there is very little research on the undesired impact of offensive cyber capabilities, and there is, to my knowledge, even though the only two papers which are out there, one from Landau, Lin, and Belovan, the other one which was presented here at CyCon a few years ago, don't really provide any details on what are the requirements. But there is another side of the bloodless war thesis, which is actually fascinating, and that's never brought up, or almost never, which is that, well, one of the reasons why you might want to use it is because, of course, your cyber warriors, if you might want to call them, are far away removed from the battlefield. And in the current environment in which we're living, in which if one of your soldiers will die on the battlefield, it will be in the media. It's no longer the case that doesn't happen, and even if it's just one person, that actually might make it more interesting. And that puts it in the same kind of box as, for example, drones and other capabilities.
Sure. And as we know, I mean, a lot of targeted cyber operations are cancelled by the lawyers. Precisely because they can't guarantee that sort of right.
And if I may finish my one other point, what is of course interesting there is that the conventional framework, we have applied a conventional legal framework to offensive cyber operations, which means that we primarily look at whether we're going to use this capability through its undesired impact of spread of effect and size of effect. But what we haven't taken into account is this time element consideration, right? If it's truly the case that you can reverse effects, then it will trump the other two, right? Because if I know that, okay, I might cause collateral damage, but I can reverse it after, it provides very interesting legal implications of usage, which haven't really been discussed, at least not in the public literature.
Great, thank you. And of course, we have a very slim evidence base in the public domain. Excellent. Thank you all three very, very much. We have 25 minutes for a Q&A and further discussion between and with the panelists. So if anyone would like to kick us off. Yep. Can you please identify yourself and keep your questions brief? I know he's a former student of mine.
Thanks, Tim.
Hi,
yes,
Christy.
I'm Christy, and I'm a security researcher at Accenture iDefense. So I had a question in response to Quentin's point, but anyone can really take it, when it comes down to coercion and the deliberate use of ambiguity as a means of strategic communication. And this is something that I've been looking at in my own research. And one thing that I would suggest when we're looking at ambiguity is it also makes it easier to do dual track messaging for the purposes both of coercion but also for influencing other audiences. So a really good example of this would be shadow brokers, where it's very clear that there's there's multiple audiences being addressed by essentially one stream of information operation. So you've got attempts to influence the US intelligence community and do signaling to the US intelligence community covertly, but also attempts to influence researchers, independent researchers in the private sector, also tracking the phenomenon, and then the wider trying to shape perceptions of American cyber operations to the general public. So I was wondering, what's your perspectives on that?
Thank you. Who'd like to kick off on that one?
Well, I'll start off by saying I think that those are all excellent points. Particularly, it goes back to the question that Tim asked at the end of my presentation, sort of thinking about the different narratives, as you call them, and the different audiences that are trying to be influenced. So it could well be that the coercive measure is expected to go through to the audience you're trying to influence, and in the second hand that you're also trying to influence other audiences so that they will see any reaction as being uncalled for instance. I think another element is just to recognize that states are actually not very good at really perceiving and understanding what another state wants. And I think that's shown up not just in terms of how the West sort of views regimes like North Korea, but I think probably North Koreans have a very skewed understanding of how the United States or Western democracies function. So I think to that extent, they also may be miscommunicating because they actually don't really understand the dynamics of how those decisions are made, for instance, about response. So I think that's another element I would add into that as well. It's something I point out to in my paper.
Either of you want to comment on this?
Sorry, would you like me to comment on
If you'd like to, it's up to you.
I could, so I think the ambiguity is an interesting one, and I wrote it already down before the question on the number of factors which play into this notion of ambiguity, right? And the ambiguity which you initially addressed as well is one of attribution ambiguity. We get then the attribution of red lines, the red line ambiguity. We get the ambiguity of what kind of effects are caused. We get the ambiguity of kind of what are the intentions. I'm not sure whether all of those are unique to cyberspace. I don't, for example, because the one which then is most oftenly pointed out is the one of attribution, where we have seen in the most recent cases that there is a lot of attribution available very early on. So it's the main comment here to make for now is that many of these things, I don't think it's a new problem when it comes to ambiguity. But that's my own personal view.
Yeah, it's interesting given the long assumed situation in which states do miscommunicate. They can be very bad at mutual communication. We've sort of always assumed that there's an escalatory dynamic in this environment that we haven't actually seen, to a large extent anyway. A lot of tit-for-tat operations, but nothing really escalating majorly between.
If I may respond to that. But I think that's quite interesting. We were so afraid of escalation. We are so afraid of getting to war. And I think the new US Cyber Command strategy has made one very good point, that there's a lot of things which we have to still consider. But the key thing which comes out of that through this notion is, but a lot of the things below the threshold of conflict still can have strategic effect, right? And so we are all really happy that we might have deterrence at this highest level, that no real cyber war has taken place, and all these kind of things. And yet you might have actors who on ongoing cumulative campaigns are still able to cause strategic effects. And I think that's something which is still not well understood in our community, and we have to do a lot more research on that.
Yeah, that speaks to stability and instability and various thresholds and so on.
Well, yeah, not just threshold, but think about, for example, even the conflation between espionage and an attack, between where offense and defense starts, et cetera, et cetera.
No, and if I could just ask you specifically, how does this issue of ambiguity and possibly fuzzy communication affect decision making?
So I think ambiguity in general coercive behavior is to be avoided at all possible. And I think that I might be one of the few people that says that so bluntly, and I'm saying it bluntly, deliberately, because if you look at over time, the history of deterrence in the post-World War II era, you're right, communication issues are a fundamental problem of engaging in strong deterrent behavior and deterring adversaries. And so why make... So all of the scholars, historical scholars and current scholars on deterrence say that you need to be clear and specific on deterrence. And yet, in 2016, NATO establishes an ambiguous deterrence platform. So historical studies on deterrence almost exclusively talk about that you need to be crystal clear with your adversary that they can't cross this particular line in the sand. And if the line wavers, then what you do see is what Joel Brenner, the former head of counterintelligence executive, says is a death by 1,000 cuts. Because they're literally going to go and try and figure out where that ambiguous line lies. And so if you don't, and it's the same with my, I go back to my kids, because it's just, if they don't know exactly where good behavior and bad behavior resides, then they will continuously try to gain new benefits from that particular behavior.
Thank you very much. We have a gentleman waiting very patiently on the right there, and then we've got Jason at the front, Carsten, and then the gentleman at the front. But yes, please.
Thank you. Rod Beckstrom, chairman of the Stanford Cybersecurity Policy Program Advisory Board. Max, nice to see you here. Excellent discussion. I was also former CEO of ICANN and former director of the National Cybersecurity Center in the US. The land of cyber is a land of a million riddles and a land of a lot of unintended recursive effects. The question I have for the panel is, if one assumes that every offensive cyber weapon that one develops can and will either be leaked or discovered at some point in time, and if it's still efficacious, it can and will be used against you, then how do you decide how much of an arsenal of cyber offensive weapons to develop?
Great question, and a thorny one. Who'd like to pick this up?
So I think it's a great question, and I would take it one step back and refer to what Max said about reversibility. I think that every weapon developed has to be also considered for returnability, not just the ability to reverse the effect once you engage the effect, but the potential for your adversary to return that weapon against your own system. And so I think Trey Hare's here somewhere as well, and he does more vulnerability equities than I do. But I think the notion of developing weapon system, it's going to happen. So I mean, and it probably should happen. And quite frankly, the development of weapon systems helps to facilitate defensive mechanisms within cyberspace as well. Understanding how to breaking into systems, pen testing, all these other types of things, it can be very, very helpful in providing substantial defensive mechanisms. Whether to hoard those or whether to utilize those in an offensive capability, not only do you have to consider the reversibility of the effect, but also the returnability of the effect, even if the effect is disclosed accidentally, and how fast you can recover if your weapon system is released. And I refer to it as a weapon system just because DoD in the US refers to it as weapon system.
Max, I know you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I interpret your question of like leaked, so like pre-use, right? And we assume that. And I think there's a very important caveat here is that, to use an analogy, it's not that cyber weapons are kind of like ready-made sandwiches which lie in the fridge, so to say, and can be stolen. I once used the kitchen analogy to explain its process, but of course we have in the kitchen, we have chefs in the kitchen, which are the most important, the people, the skills, etc., etc. Then we might have infrastructure, then we can have products maybe in the fridge, which we kind of grab and take, occasionally can combine them to provide a product which we then use in a certain operation, and there's different preparation times, and there are different times of cooking and eating, so to say, when the payload is delivered. And that's important for our understanding. We now do too often as if kind of, and of course we have seen cases where whole malware strings are put on are put on the open to kind of get a sense of what can be leaked and what can't be leaked, which capabilities are inherently still also in the domain of state actors, right? Not every single state, even if certain capabilities are leaked, is able to build this infrastructure around it to test it and retest it. That doesn't always come to a benefit, right? In certain cases, you want to have that infrastructure to make sure that you indeed can minimize undesired impact, et cetera, et cetera. But it's important to put it in context and not draw the analogy too far with conventional capabilities.
Well, I would just add, first of all, I'm intrigued by the analogy with sandwiches, because sometimes in cyber, it's almost like you go to the refrigerator case, you say, well, when did we make that sandwich? And somebody says, it's been a little while, I'm not sure about the mayo on that. You may want to think a couple times, but not to belabor that too much. To get back to the question about how much do you want, I think if you were Cyber Command sitting here, they would say a lot more than we have now, because they want to, quite frankly, be relevant to the joint fight. I think the other piece is there's been a lot of talk about reversibility, and I don't think necessarily in a military context that you want reversibility. I mean, it'd be nice to have, but it would be great also that if I could use my cyber capabilities so that I can permanently disable the integrated air defense system of another country, and I don't have to put my pilots at risk to do that. That would be great for me as a military. So I just want to, I mean, there are other questions that come up in that, and how much guarantee can you have on that? But I think we should be thinking about these as a broad array of different kinds of tools, some of which need to be pretty exquisite because you're doing something like trying to go after a secret or not so secret nuclear program. And some of them I don't have to be exquisite. Actually, cyber doesn't have to be an exquisite tool. It can be a pretty blunt tool if I'm in the middle of a fight and I just need it to do something. And if my only guarantee for it to really work is maybe to not be exquisite and reversible, but to be kind of blunt and just like dropping a bomb.
Great, thank you. And of course, there's a whole debate about what to do with equities and so on. Yeah.
Sure.
Jason Healy.
Hi, thanks. Jason Healy from Columbia University. I've been struggling over the last 2 years because as we've been working on theory, practice has really been booming along in the last 2 years in ways that haven't been good for society overall, but it's really tough for theorists because now we got to try and work through that. So 4 that I've been trying to work through myself, and I'm curious how it worked through yours. Max, you already mentioned constant contact, this realization that the forces are always in this persistent engagement. That influence has ended up being more important in how we think about this as it's tied to cyber power, that it appears that friction and sabotage are almost a use of force in itself, an end of the use of force in itself, certainly the way the Russians practice it. And now, at least according to Clapper, we have at least one clear case of cyber deterrence. He said that in the sit-room conversations, several of the options were off the table to deal with Russian election interference because of Russian presence in the electrical grid. And so to me, it's not theoretical anymore. You've gutted admission that some of our options were off the table. So I'm curious how, now that practice is catching up while you're trying to write theories, how you're working through each of those and how that might change the direction that you're taking. Thank you.
Over to the panel.
Well, I trust Jay to always put like the really big questions on the table and challenge us. I think those are all 4 really good points, particularly the last one about, have we become constrained in our decision making because of the concern we have for what potential adversary could do to us. I guess the only point I would make on that is some of it comes back to my banging the drum about context. To retaliate against the Russians for what they did in the elections and then be worried about what they would do to our electric grid. It seems like that would be an extreme leap of escalation on the Russians' part. I'm not sure how much I would put credence in that, to be honest. I'm not denying that it may have been part of the discussion, but I think we have to also look at what are we responding to, what are we trying to deter, what are we deterring ourselves from, and if at the end of the day we were worried that the Russians were going to take a pretty extreme step in response, that's where I think the clear deterrence statements would be one to come out with, saying we are responding to Russian activity. And by the way, Russia, we know where you are, and we're not going to stand for any kind of reaction from there.
Thank you.
I think in my 2016 book, I illustrate fairly well that large-scale attacks in cyberspace that would rise above what would be a clear threshold are less likely because they lose a lot of the features that make cyber attacks very beneficial. I agree that constant contact is a fundamental of cyberspace operations, and I was just reading a fabulous book about Korean operations during the Korean War, and about how the Army lost constant contact with Chinese forces, and then it took a new commander to come in and reestablish the traditional military presence of consistent, constant contact so that they know our strength, we know their strength. And again, I think these are ambiguity reducing measures, which gets to this third point. If the Russians are in our system, then presumably we also have similar capabilities as well. And so having the constant contact that allows both sides to know you have a weapon system, I have a weapon system. We shouldn't both use these weapon systems because we would both lose, or we would both suffer some sort of cost that would be not desirable. Then that in and of itself can be a beneficial deterrent, and that can act as a clear, non-ambiguous signaling mechanism.
Great. I think, can we move to another question? You think, Karsten, I think you had a question.
Thank you. My name is Karsten Friis. I work at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you for really good talks, and I'm looking forward to see your papers. But my question is still the kind of my first impression when I see these panels and all the papers we you know, when we discuss these topics these days. We take classical war, conventional war theory, and we put it on a cyber with a cyber prefix. And we see if it works and see if it fits. And as all of you have pointed out, there are certain limits to it. And you point to the expanded toolbox or the context and the empirical cases that we try to use. I don't see it so much in practice. So my kind of critical overarching question is if these theories, these concepts you're talking about, when we had one case that Jason just mentioned that potentially was a case of deterrence, intentionally or not. But we don't have much cases of compellers and deterrence, do we? We have harassment and theft and espionage. But are we talking about some theoretical concepts that we don't see so much in practice? That's my broad question. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Who would like to address that, Max?
I think it directly relates to the actually earlier discussion. And my short answer is yes, what we've discussed here is something which we do not see very often. And I think it goes to Jay's earlier point, which is that constant contact is certainly not kind of an option, but it's kind of a structural feature, right? And so that's, I think, one of the interesting dimensions which makes deterrence more difficult. But above all, and that's where I kind of tend to disagree with Dr. Brantley, is that, yes, high-level attacks, there might be certain futures which might make them more difficult. But actually what I believe is going on is much more one that everything that below the threshold indeed, these ongoing activities, in need of espionage, still have strategic effects, right, as I mentioned before. And you don't need to go above this level. You don't need to go to the level of warfare. But we have been so focused on that to lose sight of the fact that through a number of other means, like other actors can still change what might be called the balance of power, right? So specifically, if you take a case like China, where you can constantly steal from a wide range of actors over a long period of time a great deal of intellectual property or like whatever kind of information on the Joint Strike Fighter, or if you then go to Europe and steal other documents, and we're not talking about a few, but an enormous amount. That over time has huge strategic effects. Why would you need to go all the way up to this conventional threshold of warfare to go and to cause its strategic effect? I don't believe they need to, and we can think about a variety of other cases around that as well.
Okay, do you want to address very briefly, if you would? Yeah.
Really quickly. So I think I agree with you. So I think that the context is that in most conventional settings we don't have examples of lots of small strategic effects over time. So I mean, how many times do you see multiple troop movements taking over, advancing a border without us responding, or how often do you see us, a strategic bombing campaign that takes just below, or something like that, or something. The only example I can really think of is the Republic of Georgia. The Russians have been slowly advancing the Ossetian and Abkhaz administrative zone boundaries outward, and the Georgians consider this strategic advances outwards across roads. And so, yeah, I can see that in cyberspace this can be a very strong mechanism, and I think that that's something that we need more examples of this in the kinetic literature to draw on to build a more dynamic analysis.
So I'll just add in really quick. I think that these theories still are relevant. It's just that we need to be clear about what we're talking about. We tend to sort of allow things to collide across a lot of different things, and particularly cyberspace. I mean, everybody's in on the game now, right? And so they're all trying to talk about these things, like the Secretary Panetta using the analogy of the cyber Pearl Harbor. The people have criticized that a lot, tried to say, well, Pearl Harbor, the actual physical attack and everything's very different from what could happen in cyberspace. So I think, without being pedantic, I think there's a lot of scope for being a little bit more rigorous in how we're talking about these terms, what we're applying them to, what theory can and cannot tell us, and where it's helpful. Chinese cyber activity is very different from what the Russians are doing, I would say.
Okay, we have time. I'm going to take two questions together. I might not get to yours, sir, sorry, but we have a question at the front and then the gentleman just behind you on the right. So if you...
Thank you very much. Philip Kruger, I run the German National Cybersecurity Hub and the Agile Cyber Deterrence program at Fraunhofer Society. Just a quick question regarding the problem of credible threat of cost imposition. You mentioned that in your slides, and it was discussed yesterday at MSC, and nobody really found a solution. So I'd love to give the question back to the panel. You said it depends on what you want to deter. So let's assume you want to deter low-level, left-of-boom, malicious attacks. And perhaps also, that would be interesting for me as a German, assume that the deterrer is a cyber middle power like Germany or the Netherlands, who is conflict adverse. Thank you.
And, yep, just behind you. To the right, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Anders Kalin. I'm the Senior Cybersecurity Advisor at the Swedish MFA. Very interesting presentations. I have one question. Since ambiguity seems to be sort of an important strategic element, when we talk about conflict prevention in sort of the political diplomatic arena, we often talk about predictability. And that is sort of one of the key sort of features of international cooperation in trying to establish peace and security. And it's been, so of course, if you look at the nuclear area, of course, predictability is really important, that you can predict the actions of the opponent. So many countries are now, my question is really from the policymaker's perspective. So many countries are now developing its so-called active capabilities. The question then is with regard to doctrine, because of course a lot of these things are ongoing and there's a lot of thinking going on in different kinds of defense establishments, intelligence establishments within MODs, etc. But the question is whether states should develop official doctrines on how they intend to use their capabilities, or whether they should not do that, because that would sort of limit their sort of potential in future conflict scenarios. So that is my question. What advice would you give to policymakers with regard to establishing public official doctrines on how to use their active capabilities? Thank you.
Okay, so two issues about credibility, doctrine. Perhaps start with you, Quentin, just pick and mix.
I'll just address the cost imposition. I think some of it is that there are a lot of different things that you can do both within cyberspace but also beyond to try to impose costs on those actors who are carrying out whether it's law enforcement actions, economic sanctions was mentioned this morning. I think sometimes it just comes down to balancing the strategic questions of what are the responses that are going to come out of doing these kinds of things. You know, I see Michael Daniels here in the room. He can probably tell you about the difficulty of trying to get consensus about what is a reasonable response to take. So it's not as though the options aren't there. I think it's trying to balance them. From an operational perspective, if I'm sitting at Cybercom, I can say, I have all sorts of things I could do for you. Just let me go get them. And as a policymaker, I say, well, hold up. let's think about the broad strategy and context here. So I think those are things that need to be taken into account. But you know, happy to carry on the conversation afterwards.
I'll go to the doctrine thing. I think doctrine helps to facilitate predictability. And I think that predictability helps to mitigate uncertainty, and uncertainty typically leads to bad choices. And so I think that is a step in the right direction. It is not the solution. Obviously, the U.S. has lots of doctrine. We are overwhelmed by doctrine, but but it does help make it more predictable.
Yeah, just final thoughts on the signaling incredible threat. So the starting point here is that we can't prove often what capability we have a priori, right, before use. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't make credible threats. And why is that the case is because we might end up in this situation as what we call cheap talk, right? Where we can't prove what we have, but we can still communicate. Now, one of the key cases in which cheap talk is still effective is through reputation, right? And then we see very interesting discussions. I see Dr. Lebicki here in the audience who once mentioned that, yes, the Snowden leaks might be one of the most embarrassing things for the US government, but it also has, or for the NSA at least, but it has also shown us how far and how deep they could go into networks of others, and it created a certain reputation. And I do believe that certain actors now, especially in this case, will believe that something is going on. And that is also directly ties into the doctrine aspect, right? Doctrine normally is one of theory and practice, by the way, and I think that many lack the practice to develop a good doctrine up front. But then the question is, what are you developing this doctrine for? Are you doing this purely for indeed internal reasons to actually conduct better operations? Or are you doing this as a signaling device because you actually can't signal actual capabilities? And I think too often, and we have seen public documents, public statements, new cyber commands, people showing off what kind of the whiz kids are, all those kind of things. Do they really do this for their own purposes, or do they do this for signaling? And I think it's the latter in many ways, because they can't signal the actual capability.
Yeah, but if you have doctrine, you should declassify it. We don't want any ambiguity a la India and cold start developing in cyber. Great, thank you all very much, and thank you for your questions. Sorry we didn't get to you. I'll just close on the question that constantly emerges, does deterrence work in cyberspace? Is there such a thing as cyber deterrence? Can compellence work? Well, I think there is a role for deterrence and compellence, although I totally, channeling Carsten's mind here, just take cyber off the front, because this is strategy. It's not just restricted to this domain. If deterrence has a role in and through cyberspace, it must be as part of a much wider deterrence strategy, and I think we can agree with that, and the same goes for compellence. So it just remains for me to thank our panelists, thank you, and express your gratitude in the traditional manner.